All right, everybody. Now I can welcome to Drupal Behaviors for Data Protection. My name is Matt Obert. I work for Esteemed, and I'm just trying to make sure I get focus here so I can actually change the slides. Will that work now? No. I'm going to change the slide. I can't even tell what screen I'm on, really. Yay! Okay, guys. All right. So many things to talk about. Let's get started. Drupal behaviors for data protection. So companies love analytics. They love to track impressions on landing pages and leads and conversions. Let's say you have a client that works with a third-party data partner. We'll call them TPDP Incorporated. Let's see if I can do this. I just got it to advance the slide and now it's not doing it. All right, no problem. There we go, TPDP. So third-party data partners, they say stuff like the collect code should be placed just before the closing head tag, or the page view code should be placed directly below the head tag following the above tag. But managing JavaScript assets with snippets like this is such a 1996 style approach. So if you're a front-end developer, you probably know that it is possible to include these snippets directly in a Twig template, but that's not the best way to manage JavaScript in Drupal. In this presentation, I'll show you a few different ways of including JavaScript in Drupal projects. But first, let's talk about data protection. There's my favorite slide with the fortune cookie. I don't know if it's too small for you guys to read, but I'll just read it for you. It says, we have updated our privacy policy. By accepting cookies, you agree to be tracked. Learn HTTP 200 OK. Hopefully you guys haven't seen this joke before because I actually had those fortune cookies made when the GDPR came out for the people at the agency that I worked at the time. Let's see if I can get a little bit less glare on myself. That's just a different angle than I'm used to. So the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is a legal framework that sets guidelines for the collection and processing of personal information of individuals within the European Union. GDPR was activated across the EU on May 25th, 2018. And the CCPA is the newish one in California, the California Consumer Privacy Act. That's a state statute intended to enhance privacy rights and consumer protection for residents of California in the United States. CCPA was activated in California on January 1st, 2020. So that is pretty new, and we're all just getting used to it. But remember, I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. So let's get to know the GDPR. First of all, the additional resources down at the bottom are, I leaned on these pretty heavily. The first one is from DrupalCon in Nashville, and the second one from Design for Drupal in Boston in 2018, the year that everybody was talking about GDPR coming out. And those are both, they'll go into a lot more depth than I will here. But essentially, GDPR is a data privacy regulation. Your IP address is considered personal data. So if the server's logging an IP address, and they all do, then that's considered tracking. And whether or not you get slapped with a big fine comes down to other factors, such as whether you're actually making money off of people in the European Union. And they tend to go for very flagrant violators. But essentially, the data privacy regulation says users can withdraw consent and reserve the right to object to processing. And consent is always required with few legal exceptions. Security should be up to the highest available standards. Security and compliance methods are outlined across 99 articles. And I did mean to update this slide. It still says it's enforced by national data protection authorities such as the ICO in the UK. But it occurred to me after I made the slide that because of Brexit, the UK isn't in the European Union. So your mileage may vary there. But anyway, all of the European countries have data protection authorities similarly named. And the penalties can be massive if you don't comply with the GDPR. You can get fines of up to 20 million euros or 4% of your company's annual revenue. There's potential for audits and sanctions, and consumers have the right to sue. So even if you're not a really huge company that does a lot of business in the European Union, you could still be liable to being sued by an individual who's a European citizen. And it's important also to note that geolocation based on IP address is not a reliable way of determining whether someone is a European national accessing your website. And the way that the law is written, somebody who's a citizen of Ireland or of Germany or something can be sitting in their hotel room in Los Angeles or New York and accessing your website. And because they are a citizen of the European Union, you can't tell based on their IP address because they're in the United States. Let's not even get into VPNs, because I can certainly open a VPN tunnel right now that says I'm in Australia, even though I'm sitting here in Providence, Rhode Island. So the GDPR compliance really, it just comes down to trying to determine whether you're liable to be sued based on, generally they've only imposed these fines on flagrant violators that are very large companies that have really flagrant violations. Then there's the CCPA. It's another data privacy regulation. Again, the IP address is considered personal data. You must provide an opt-out link. Not the site visitor, but the site designer must provide a link, a DNSMPI, which stands for Do Not Sell My Private Information. And it's an opt-out link so that if a site visitor comes and you're tracking them, then they can click on that and say, stop tracking me, and then you have to stop tracking them. Consent is only required for minors and for previous opt-outs. And I'm not really a lawyer, so I don't know the full extent of this here, but how can you tell for sure whether someone is a minor? If consent is required for minors, then perhaps you need to assume that consent is required for all site visitors unless you can reliably determine that they're not a minor. I don't know. So there's some gray areas also with this legislation. The security requirements are not quite as strict as they are for the GDPR. There are no explicit security requirements defined in the law beyond reasonable security. But it leans on something called CIS controls for reference, and that's the Center for Internet Security. You'll see in the additional resources link on the slides, there's a link to cisecurity.org controls, and that's the list of reasonable security that the California law basically uses to determine whether a site is in compliance. Consumers can seek damages for subpar security practices. There can be fines of up to $7,500 for each violation, fine of up to $750 per affected user. Consumers have the right to sue, but this, unlike the GDPR, applies only to for-profit businesses. So even if you have a massive nonprofit business that does a lot of business in the state of California, you may be immune to the CCPA. Again, I'm not a lawyer. So what we're going to look at now is essentially, this is a partial list of contrib modules that will help you to bring your Drupal site into compliance with these data privacy regulations. I've omitted modules without a stable release candidate since they're not covered by the Drupal security policy. And in general, these things apply to business-oriented sites that are going to have some if you've got e-commerce or something, you're going to be concerned about security anyway, and you probably want to only use stable releases of things anyway. So we've got a clear winner here. EU cookie compliance module is just by orders of magnitude the most popular method of securing your site or bringing it into compliance with these rules. I have looked into Cookie Pro, which is a little bit of a bizarre thing. It's a service, it's essentially a web-based service that you make an account on their site, and they provide a panel that the company can go into that and set some preferences for how different JavaScripts are allowed, different cookies are allowed, all sorts of different things are allowed. And that's all managed outside of Drupal on Cookie Pro's website. OneTrust is the company. So it's interesting what they offer. Some companies insist on it. But you'll notice the Cookie Pro CCPA module, when I checked, only has one site using it. The Cookie Pro module has 404 sites using it, compared to 95,676 sites using EU cookie compliance. So the other popular, semi-popular, it's only less than 1,000 for the GDPR compliance module, but you'll notice that is 8 only. It doesn't have a release candidate for Drupal 9 or 7. So I'm just focusing on EU cookie compliance. And in the remainder of this, if I've got any time left, I will show you guys how to bring your site into compliance with these, with this contributed module. So right out of the box, you'll notice that the EU cookie compliance module offers you this little banner that pops up you can have it be on the bottom of the site. You can have it be at the top of the site, send it wherever you want. If you don't like purple, you can change the configuration just in the admin UI just by clicking on, you put in a different color or whatever you want to do. You can change what your privacy policy is and all sorts of different things, what it says on the buttons. It's a very highly user configurable module, but essentially out of the box, this is what it offers you. And this doesn't necessarily ensure compliance, but it offers you a pretty easy way of enforcing the compliance. The basic configuration looks like this. Sorry for the small print, but essentially the small print says, when using the opt-in or opt-out consent options, you can block certain JavaScript files from being loaded when consent isn't given. This is a simple configuration which may be sufficient for compliance without custom code. The linked issue queue describes how to disable Google Tag Manager via this method and manage all your other scripts via GTM. So you can have everything managed outside of your site by Google Tag Manager, and you can just very simply in this configuration box for the EU cookie compliance, have it turn on Google Tag Manager when someone consents to cookies, and that will bring you into basic compliance without much configuration. But again, part of that, just as with Cookie Pro, is outside of Drupal completely in Google Tag Manager, which isn't the focus of this talk. I'm going to show you how to do this all within Drupal by writing your own custom code and a custom module, and it will leverage something that's provided by the EU cookie compliance module, which is this has agreed behavior. So essentially, has agreed is it returns true if the user has granted consent. If they click the button that says, okay, you can track me, then this simple function, it's a method, it will return true. And that's all you need to know. You can use this to test whether or not the consent has been granted. And if it's been granted, then enable your tracking. And this is a simple example, which is based on a Drupal.org issue queue for EU cookie compliance and for Google Analytics in particular. But we'll come back to this one in a minute, because what it actually does is it goes ahead and it loads Google Analytics, and then it uses JavaScript to pass this consent toggle to Google Analytics saying, I know Google, you've already seen my IP address, but please don't track me now. And is that really compliant? But first, let's talk about Drupal Behaviors, which is the primary focus of this talk. Drupal Behaviors are Drupal's version of document ready. So they've been part of Drupal since at least Drupal 6. And I've got a link on this slide to the official documentation, which you can find in the Drupal Chattanooga website. You can download a PDF of all the slides. Essentially, this is an example of just the structure of what a behavior looks like. You're gonna, there's a behavior name object that's added as a property of the Drupal.behaviors object. You may notice that the has agreed behavior on the previous slide was namespace to the EU cookie compliance module, but I highly recommend using the pattern shown here to create your own behaviors. If you need to attach multiple behaviors, I recommend using Drupal.behaviors.my_custom_module behavior, and then that way, when I'll show you in the next slide essentially how these things are all loaded. And that allows you to register all of your custom behaviors quite automatically with something that's built into Drupal core. So these are the characteristics of a behavior. Behaviors provide an easy way to initialize JavaScript on page loads and to reinitialize on AJAX calls. The Drupal.behaviors object is a property of the Drupal object, and we extend this object to add new behaviors to our module. The new object needs to have at least an attach method. When Drupal.attachBehaviors is called, it will iterate through all behavior objects and call their respective attach methods. Behaviors accept context and settings as arguments. And context contains DOM elements to act on, whereas settings can pass values from Drupal PHP in your custom code. So we're coming up to 3:30. I got off to a slow start, so I may be rushing this one again. But here we go. Context is awesome. If you just called document ready, it would fire off your JavaScript once the entire document object model was loaded. But Drupal behaviors are more flexible. The first time Drupal.attach behaviors is called, context will contain the entire DOM. But on subsequent calls, as when new DOM elements are inserted into the document via AJAX-driven content, it may only contain a smaller subset of the affected HTML. Settings are also awesome, but we'll return to them in a minute. Remember our third-party data partner. They wanted to inject tracking codes. And over the years, Drupal's JavaScript API has evolved. In the old days, we might have just hacked these script tags into a tpl.php file in old Drupal 6, Drupal 7, earlier. But as behaviors emerged to replace document ready, so too did the Drupal concept of libraries emerge. This example shows how to attach a script element with attributes type text JavaScript using a hook page attachments implementation. And this can be effective, but only with very short scripts, essentially one-liners. So let's see the real way to do it. These are libraries. So in your custom module, you're going to have a libraries.yaml file. So you've got a folder, my custom module, that lives in the modules directory, under custom. And then inside there, you've got my custom module.libraries.yaml. This is the real way to do it. The externally hosted collect code is defined as an externally hosted and minified library. So essentially, this is how to use a CDN. You're going to say, if you can see the YAML there, you can see where it says JS in the top stanza. And then it says HTTPS, third-party data partner / collect.js, type external, minified true. That's going to go out on the internet and grab that JavaScript from the CDN, and it's going to make it available to attach anywhere in Drupal very flexibly because it's defined now as a library in your libraries.yaml. And Drupal core does a lot of stuff to keep track of libraries. It won't load the same library twice. It's going to keep track of stuff. And it's going to load things in the right order on the page. Now, what you can see below that is that if you've got local code, you can keep that in your module in a JS folder. So you see js/tpdp.js. I wrote that. I put it in my JS folder, and then I define the library just like so. And if it has dependencies, I can also define that in the YAML and say dependency on core Jquery, core Drupal, and core JS cookie. So let's take a closer look at this. I'll lose my place in here. Right, so the page view code was defined as a behavior in the tpdp.js file, which can contain as many libraries as we need. Note also that our behaviors depend on core Drupal and core Jquery, and I also declared a dependency on the new JS cookie library in core. And note also that if it is really important to the third-party data partner to have the page view code placed directly below the head tag, you may still need to add it to html.html.twig. This example on slide 17 shows how to attach a library using a hook page attachments implementation. This is the preferred method of managing JavaScript assets in Drupal. So you're going to call hook page attachments, and it's going to say attachments attached library equals my custom module /tpdp. And that refers to the library that was defined in the YAML. It's going to look in the YAML and see what files are part of that library. It could be JavaScript, it could be CSS. So, and it's only going to attach that when it's needed if it hasn't already been loaded. So there's a lot of good reasons to use libraries instead of just sticking things into your template files. This is how you define a behavior in a text file in your own custom module library. All JavaScript behaviors must be declared inside a closure wrapping the whole file. Behaviors are declared as objects, and they must have an attach method, as I mentioned before. And then the next line selects a DOM element within the context which your behavior will attach to. So let's take a closer look at this. Selector.context. Essentially, selector can be any selector used to identify any DOM element, class, ID element, pseudo element, etc. And as you can see in the slide, it says try substituting div for body here, and you'll see that the behavior will run once for each div in the DOM. And the reason why that's happening is because I use this once each pattern, which I'm about to describe in a little bit more detail. So selector comma context, you're passing the context, and you're declaring a selector that you want to attach this to, and then you're going to pass the context, which is a chunk of the DOM that you want to work on, and then .once, .each. You can chain these methods, and essentially this will attach your behavior once to each element that matches the selector. There's another cool trick that you can do to prevent your behavior from loading too many times, which I just copied this one from a module somewhere. I saw this somewhere in some source code for some other module, and I just thought it was a really neat trick. This will fire exactly once on document load, just like the old days. If that's what you wanted, was for it to be like a document on load kind of this is how to get that with a Drupal behavior. So essentially, if type of context location isn't undefined, do stuff. So that will do it just once when the page loads. Now, the reason for this stuff is because if all the developers properly used the API, you would likely not have to use once. However, you cannot count on developers using the API correctly, so once insulates you against that. This is because the context passed to Drupal.behaviors is part of the DOM passed by developers when calling Drupal.attachBehaviors. However, a lot of the documentation on the web has not specifically stated this, resulting in many developers not passing any value to Drupal.attachBehaviors. And if no value is passed, then the entire DOM becomes the context. This means that your code could be passed through your handler multiple times. This is why once is used. So, settings. This is where it really gets fun. I'm sorry, we're at 3:35, but we do have plenty of time. We have 10 minutes to get through the rest of the slides. And we're on slide number 22 out of 30, so I think we should be good. So when we attach our libraries, we can also pass values to Drupal settings, but we're not using that here yet. You can sort of see it in the slide that context is lit up in the syntax highlighting of my PHP storm, but settings is grayed out because I'm not actually using that in this code example. Let's see, we're on 22. So notice the line under the console log statement where we pair a value with the set org ID key and push it to our data partner. What if the data partner wants us to use a sandbox API in non-production environments? How can we set this value dynamically? I'll show you how to do this next with a hook implementation in your star.module file. Remember hook page attachments? This example uses Acquia Cloud environment variables to determine whether to use sandbox or production org ID values, but it could be modified to use environment variables for Pantheon or other hosting. Now let's see how we modify the TPDP library to receive the dynamically assigned org ID. And I'm sorry if I'm going through this a little quickly, but you can download the slides and you can look at the source code at your leisure. One of these days, I'm going to start it on time and not rush the slides, but it's okay. We're on slide 24. Note that we are checking for consent via has agreed before executing the tracking snippet. Note also that we are receiving the value that we generated via the hook implementation in the previous step so that we can send it to our data partner. And I don't know if I can actually, I'm probably not going to, don't worry about it. I was going to see if I could kind of mouse over that, but I think you can see there that that essentially where you're saying TPDP push set org ID, it's actually pushing settings dot mycustommodule.tpdp.org ID. And if I go back to the previous slide, you can see how we attached that. We looked at what the org ID was, And it was either, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, or it was 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on the environment. And then we attach that in the following way. It says attachments, attached, Drupal settings, and then you namespace it. I put my custom module, TPDP org ID. The TPDP in there is extra, but I did that for this example because say you have in your module multiple APIs that have their own namespaces. You can do that very easily. And this is how you get it on the other end. You're in your JavaScript, you've got this settings dot mycustommodule.tpdp.org ID, and that's a data member of this object that you can get that you pass to it back in the PHP. So it's really, really cool. And that allows you to dynamically set in your custom module different values based on anything that Drupal knows about that you can then make available to your JavaScript behaviors. Let's go on to slide 25. Cookies, right? You figured it was about tracking, so there should be something about cookies. Well, here's how you handle cookie setting in a GDPR or CCPA compliant kind of Drupal behavior. You check for consent first, and once again, we're using we're leveraging the Drupal EU compliance .has agreed method to determine whether or not consent has been given. If consent has not been given, return. We are out of there. We're not going to process any of this code. But if it has been given, then you can go in and use cookies.set. Essentially what I've done here is I wrap it in cookies.get, and I check to see whether the cookie already exists. And if it doesn't exist, then I set it. So basically, cookie not set, consent given, you may legally set the cookie. Do it. Oh, and by the way, on the last slide, I will just say I'm using cookies.set and cookies.get. This is kind of new. There's a major effort right now to remove jQuery dependencies from Drupal core for Drupal 9. And so even in Drupal 8, just to make sure that things are forward thinking, we're trying to not use jQuery to set the cookies. And instead, the jQuery.cookie implementation is deprecated in favor of core/JS cookie, which is what I'm showing you how to do that in this slide. So using has agreed with Google Analytics, I kind of alluded to this earlier. What really happens when you add this snippet to advanced settings custom JS in Google Analytics? Drupal loads this JavaScript from Google Analytics and executes it. If consent is not granted, we send information back to Google from an IP address saying, don't show the client the analytics. Well, the client won't see it on the Google Analytics dashboard, but Google gets all that data. They like to just vacuum up all the data they can get. Is that really GDPR compliant? Maybe from the point of view of your end client who hired you to make this, they're saying, well, we don't get to see the analytics, but Google still gets some data. And the client, like the browser client, still can see tracking code downloaded and executed. So, your hypothetical Irish guy sitting in his hotel room in New York is going to see, if he's tech savvy, that he's being tracked. He's being tracked and then flagged not to track so much. So that's not really in compliance. But I can show you how to achieve stricter compliance with Drupal behaviors. Rather than getting, let's see, this is using has agreed with the Drupal behaviors. Essentially, this shows it's a bit more compliant because it gets the opt-out JavaScript from Drupal rather than from Google. So, that helps to get Google out of the middle. But what if your client is really, really paranoid and they just want to make sure that no cookies are set and no JavaScript is executed until that consent is granted? We can do that too. The first step is to remove all of the JavaScript tracking snippets from your site completely, and you put something else where you want to inject them. And this can be accomplished in a variety of ways. Here's an example where I just put a div with a class that's known to me that I'm going to be scanning for, and with an ID that's unique for each element. So in this case, I replaced dozens of different third-party forms with an empty div element, and the ID corresponded to the unique third-party form ID for each form. The next step is to remove all the JavaScript tracking snippets from your site completely and put something else where you'll want to inject them. And this can be accomplished in a variety of ways. I think I'm repeating myself. I'm on, I'm on slide 30 now. The next step is to locate all those elements and bail out if you don't find any on the page. This follows a pattern that I showed you a few slides ago. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time. It's 3:42. I'll breeze through this part really quickly, but you can find the slides later. If consent has not been granted, or if the EU cookie compliance module is not installed or enabled and therefore has agreed is not available, then my custom module uses the 4-digit ID to look up substitute content that says something like, please accept cookies to view the Yo-Yo Dine Incorporated Nomovision mailing list subscription form, or whatever the particular form is. You may want to ask a lawyer before you do this, because there may also be a requirement that there's equivalent functionality provided for people that aren't being tracked. So that is also one wrinkle. But let's just say that there's two versions of the form. One of them tracks you and one of them doesn't. So consent hasn't been given. You have to give them the form that doesn't track them. And then if consent has been granted, then my custom module uses the 4-digit ID to inject the JavaScript snippet for each of the third-party forms into the placeholder div using a combination of string manipulation and a call to the Jquery getScript method. I leave the implementation details as an exercise to the viewer, but if you have any questions, please ask. And I'm just going to close with this technique, which is a new one for me. It's called JavaScript type rewriting. Cookie Pro, who I mentioned before, does say in their docs that this is one of the most efficient methods of preventing cookies controlled by script tags from being set without consent. They also say this method requires the least amount of change to your site. Well, I haven't tested it yet, but it's basically the same idea as my div injection, which I demonstrated above. Note that requiring cookie consent for site functionality may not be fully compliant with data privacy laws unless you provide an equivalent experience for users who opt out. So that's just in time for 3:44. Remember, I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. In general, the best practice is to code for the strictest interpretation of the applicable statutes. If your client is looking for a loophole, have them consult with their legal department. Don't be afraid to raise a flag if you feel that your client is exposing you to legal liability. And I'm going to watch the screen now to see if anybody has any questions for me. But in the meantime, thank you to Drupal Camp Chattanooga for having me. Thank you to, of course, Drupal Contractors by Esteemed for encouraging me to do this. And we're always hiring. Esteemed is always hiring. And in fact, we're also always helping people. If you're hiring, if you're looking for staffing needs, we've got that for you as well. So feel free to stop by our booth in the expo and talk to us. I'm not seeing any. Let me just see if I can. Any questions? That seems like it's probably it. I can't even tell. There's 17 people in here, so I do have an audience. I feel like I might have lost some of my audience with my 10 minutes of technical difficulties at the beginning, but such is life. So let me know if you have any other questions about my presentation, about Drupal behaviors, about JavaScript in general, about tracking, about the EU cookie compliance module, about the GDPR or the CCPA, although I'm not the greatest authority on every nuance of those laws, but I do have a pretty broad knowledge of that as well. So, and I certainly, I tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to compliance with these regulations. It may be true that your client is flying under the radar because they're not so big or because they're a nonprofit, or they may not fully need to comply. But in general, it's just being a good webizen to, to have your site ask for permission before you rudely track people, But at the same time, companies got to get that analytics data, and they got to get as much as they can so that they can build their, generate leads and close deals. So there's that as well. And it's a balancing act. And essentially, I have shown you so that if you need to be extremely cautious about it, you can absolutely lock that down. I think that's, oh, there's Chris. Hi, Chris. Chris, you wanna invite people over to the Drupal contractors booth for the next 15? I think I'm done. Or we could try to, I don't know if I can share, if anybody else can, hi, Chris. So far, the one question I can see says, it was a great session. So thank you. You were a great audience. I apologize again for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I can't believe it. I did test it on this Mac, but Hopin just blew up the Mac, which is what I generally use for the webcam. My fast workstation, my Linux workstation, doesn't have a webcam. Maybe I should, just buy one and put it on there. But it's not a laptop, so it doesn't have a webcam. Oh, you guys are checking. Hi, Bo, Chris, everybody. Yeah, if anybody also has any questions that aren't about my presentation that are about Esteemed, I encourage you to go over to our booth, click your I'm interested button and fill out our poll to get entered for the $250 Amazon gift card over there. Webcam. I thought this was going to be fine. It was fine for the last, at Drupal Camp Atlanta, the Mac was fine, but they did not use Hopin. They used a different platform. So maybe I need to use my newer computer, which is fine. It seems to be working with Linux. So that's good to know. It's not that you need a Mac, it's that you need a fast enough computer, which luckily I've got. Anybody else? Yes, Linux rules when properly configured. This is why I highly recommend System 76, because it costs a little bit more, but for the price of a Mac, you can get a workstation that has 12 core i7 and 64 gigabytes of RAM for about $2,500 or whatever you would spend on a new Mac. Other privacy laws in the works for the US, I do not know. The newest one that I know about is the California one. I don't really have my ear to the ground on new developments in that, but I think something tells me that we really haven't seen a lot of consumer protection laws passed in recent times, just due to really to Congress not passing a lot of laws in general, and also to the laws that they have been passing not being very focused on consumer protections. So I think that California probably is at the vanguard here in the United States of America. We'll have to see what the next few years bring in terms of that type of legislation. And I certainly will be following the news very closely. Any other questions? I feel like I'm going to wrap it up pretty soon. I'm watching the chat just in case I get another question. What is this? How does this even work? Moderation panel. Oh, that's my screen share. Yes, okay. You do have a question, but you have to finish your dinner. All right, I will wait for it.
Hey, Chris.
Hi, Mike.
I'll come help.
Got my sound way down because I was getting feedback.
Oh, no, sorry. I figured I can't help you close out. Let's see. He says, yep, I would have one. Sorry, have finished. Oh, hit again.
Oh, that is a great question. Oh my gosh. And I'm running out of time because I feel like I'm talking over somebody because I can't even hear because I turned up. Michael, it is a great question. I can't answer it now. I will have to. Why don't you track me down on? I'm Hot Web Matter on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm all over the place. If you go to my website hotwebmatter.com, you can find links to all of my social stuff, and you can track me down and ask me that question again. And I will try to give you a more detailed answer. I will have to give some thought to it. Definitely, depending on your company and the type of exposure that you anticipate having due to the nature of your business in the EU, then yes, you may find yourself liable to collect and export all of a user's data. And I'm not sure what the I better hope my website is GDPR compliant, Ralph. When you when you visit my site, I don't track you though, so I'm sure I'm fully compliant. But yeah, that's a great question. You do have to be able to gather up the whole thing and zip it up and send it to the person. And I have not had to implement that because instead, my focus has been on not implementing the tracking. You know, for clients that just wanted to be very strict about it. It's a kind of a thin slice of the GDPR, but I definitely will look into that some more and think about how you can do that. Probably something to do with Migrate API, I would think would be the best way to do that, to gather that type of data as an export. Or you could do it maybe with views. Yeah, JSON API, or you'd have to, you know, that's a funny question. You don't want to expose it to the internet. This is something that's private. Some request came into your data protection officer, and you're going to do this internally, probably not through the web facing, you know, port 80 or port 443 or whatever. You don't want to expose that. That's something that you're going to do privately, internally inside the company. And I would say more likely with a database export, you know, let's see, the file name contains the user's email address. Well, that's not great either. I mean, you need to know the email address to send it to them, I suppose, right? But you don't want to put it in the file name. But how else are you going to keep track of whose data you've exported? That's a file that you're sending. You know, it has to have a unique identifier. And generally these days we use the email address as the unique identifier, but certainly that's the exact type of personally identifiable information that is restricted under these data privacy regulations. So that's a really, really good point. But yeah, Rick, to your point, I don't think that that I would do it with JSON API unless I was doing it in a private container or like the dev environment. Or it would have to be a really locked down environment that only people that work for the company could access that type of. I mean, I suppose, you know, JSON API, you could have the authentication, you know, OAuth or whatever, so that only your secret private panel could pull it out. But, you know, at that point, like, you've already got access to Drupal's backend, right? So it just seems a little over-engineered to do it that way. Where I come from, my background is as a Linux admin and SQL administrator, and I would lean toward just pulling it out of a database, probably using the Migrate API and keeping it completely private, not giving it a web-based interface necessarily at all, you know. Right, you want the non-technical customer to be able to download their own private data. That is so, so interesting. This is great. I'm glad I'm doing these presentations because I'm definitely getting some really cool questions that I'm going to have to think about. You're absolutely right, though. If it was, boy, I'm going to have to do some research and figure out whether anybody has addressed that exact requirement of the GDPR, because it does seem like something that you would want to be able to offer people for sure. So we got 3 minutes. I'm going to ask some friends about this as well, too. I think it's a really, really fascinating slice of the the pie, as it were, of the data protection pie. It's a really interesting subset of the problem to solve. And I haven't given it much thought, to be honest. The focus of this talk is just on how to turn off your tracking until people ask you to turn it on. But yes, that is a really, really cool idea, to give it so that if people are logged into your site, essentially, if I'm understanding your suggestion, is that if people are logged into your site in their own account and they want to be able to hit that big red button that says, send me all my data, and then you zip it up and send it to them. I don't even know if JSON API would be necessary for that, though, either. I think that's something that you could do. They're logged in, right? So you could just have your private module that like literally just uses the database API, not JSON API, and pulls out all of their info and makes a file that they can download out of it. I think it is kind of, especially once you have a big enough company that you have a lot of users, and you would want to automate that, so that request fulfillment, so that when somebody hits that button, Drupal just churns it out. And I would, again, not expose that part to, maybe with JSON API, if it depends on what's the other endpoint, like how are you authenticating that and how is that secured? And, are you writing another front end that's like some Gatsby or React app that's going to get, it's Drupal, right? If they're logged into Drupal and they hit the button, then you don't need JSON API to get that data out. You could do it with views. You could do it with just a custom module that you're using the database API and pulling things out that belong to that user and making some kind of coherent report out of it that you can make into a text file or HTML, in a template. It could just be like a regular, a decoupled site, yes, but then you're talking about having another, where do they go to log into this? I mean, I've got I've been working on this Drupal site, and now somebody logged into my Drupal site needs to go to another site to get their data out of my site. It just seems over-engineered to me. I'm sure it's possible. Certainly, if you have a decoupled site, then that would be the route you would go. If people are logging in to the front end of a decoupled site, and it's already got that type of integration over JSON API with the Drupal backend, then that is exactly what you would want to do in that instance. But I don't think that's what I would do if it was actually a Drupal site. Great question, though. Really great question. Really thought-provoking. Thanks everybody again for coming. It's 4 o'clock, so I gotta close this down. But thanks again for all your great questions. And
thanks so much.
I will catch you in the next session.
Thanks so much, Matt. Wonderful presentation.